The massive crystalline chamber of the Galactic Council hummed with the translated voices of over 200 species, each representing worlds scattered across the Andromeda spiral. Ambassador Zethkar of the Threnodai Empire adjusted his ceremonial breathing apparatus as he reviewed the agenda for what he believed would be a routine session. The newest species to join their ranks, the humans from a small blue world called Earth, had requested an emergency assembly. Most council members had barely contained their amusement at the request. Humans had been part of the galactic community for exactly 47 standard cycles, a mere blink of an eye in cosmic terms. They were a young species, having only achieved faster-than-light travel through reverse engineering crashed Zeltharian scout ships. Their technology was primitive, their understanding of galactic politics laughable, and their military might non-existent by council standards. Most species viewed them as an entertaining curiosity at best. The chamber's central platform began to glow, indicating the session's commencement. High Arbiter Quelneth, an ancient being whose species had helped found the council millennia ago, raised her forearms for silence. Her voice resonated through universal translators in every known language. The emergency assembly called by the Terran delegation is now in session. Ambassador Sarah Chen of Earth, you may present your grievance. A collective rustle of dismissive sounds echoed through the chamber as a small human female approached the speaking platform. At barely 5.5 feet tall, she appeared insignificant among beings that towered over her. The Krugan representative, standing nearly 12 feet tall with armored carapace gleaming, let out what passed for laughter among his kind. Sarah Chen stood motionless for a moment, her dark eyes scanning the assembled representatives. When she spoke, her voice was steady, carrying no trace of the fear or nervousness that many species expected from such a young civilization. Honored representatives, 3 standard months ago, the hegemony of Voss launched what they termed a minor disciplinary action against 17 human colony worlds in the Kepler sector. They claimed we had violated shipping lanes that, according to our records and galactic maritime law, were designated as neutral space. The Voss representative, a creature resembling a cross between a mantis and a spider, clicked his mandibles in what translated as contempt. The primitive humans failed to understand proper protocol. Their crude vessels interfered with hegemony trade routes. The disciplinary action was minimal and appropriate. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Minimal. That's an interesting choice of words, Ambassador Esikadar. Would the council like to know what minimal meant to the hegemony? Without waiting for permission, she activated a holographic display above the platform. The images that materialized drew gasps from even the most jaded representatives. Orbital bombardments reduced entire cities to radioactive craters. Refugee ships fleeing the surface were methodically hunted down and destroyed. Most horrifying were the bioweapon attacks on agricultural centers, designed to cause maximum suffering before death. 17 worlds, Sarah continued, her voice never wavering despite the graphic images. 4.7 million human civilians, including 1.2 million children under the age of 12. The hegemony of Voss didn't just attack our ships or military installations. They systematically targeted schools, hospitals, and refugee centers. The chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence. The Andromedian Council had strict laws regarding civilian casualties, but enforcement was often selective, particularly when it involved newer species that lacked political influence. Ambassador Esikadar's mandibles clicked in annoyance. Regrettable collateral damage. War is never clean, especially when dealing with species that fail to understand their place in the galactic order. Perhaps this will serve as a valuable lesson for the humans about respecting their betters. The casual dismissal of mass murder sent a wave of indignation through the human delegation, but Sarah's expression remained controlled. I see. And what does the council say about this lesson that was taught to my people? High Arbiter Quelneth consulted with the other senior members before responding. The hegemony's actions, while regrettable in their scope, were technically within their rights under the disputed territory doctrine. The sector in question has been contested between multiple species for centuries. The Terran Federation should have been more careful about establishing colonies in such regions. The translation circuit struggled with the sounds that emerged from Sarah's throat. It took several seconds before they registered as bitter laughter. Within their rights. Of course. She turned to face the Voss delegation directly. Ambassador Esikadar, I have one more question for you. When your ships were massacring civilians on New Geneva, did any of your commanders think to ask why human evacuation ships weren't fighting back? Why our orbital defense platforms remained silent even as your forces bombarded refugee camps? Esikadar's compound eyes glittered with malicious amusement. Perhaps because you finally understood the futility of resistance against a superior species. Your pathetic technology could never threaten the hegemony's fleet. Sarah nodded slowly. You're absolutely right. Our technology couldn't threaten your fleet. She paused, letting the admission hang in the air. But that wasn't why we didn't fight back. She activated her personal communicator, and her voice carried clearly through the chamber's audio systems. Admiral Morrison, this is Ambassador Chun. Execute Protocol 7. The confusion that rippled through the chamber was palpable. What could a human admiral possibly do from whatever primitive vessel had brought their delegation to the council chambers? The answer came in the form of emergency alarms that began blaring throughout the orbital city housing the council. Red warning lights bathed the crystalline walls as automated systems announced an incoming priority transmission from the Galactic Defense Network. The main viewing screen flickered to life, showing the bridge of a Zeltharian monitoring station at the edge of the Voss home system. The lizard-like communications officer's scales had turned pale with fear. This is Deep Space Monitor 77 Alpha. We're detecting massive spatial distortions throughout the hegemony territory. Something is emerging from hyperspace. Multiple contacts. The signatures are unknown. No match in any database. The transmission switched to external sensors, and the chamber erupted in chaos. Emerging from the swirling vortexes of hyperspace were ships unlike anything in recorded galactic history. They were enormous, each one easily the size of a moon, their hulls gleaming with an almost organic sheen that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. More terrifying was their number. Dozens. Hundreds. They kept coming, materializing from hyperspace with mechanical precision around every major hegemony world. Ambassador Esikadar's compound eyes fixed on the display in obvious terror. This is impossible. No species possesses such technology. Where did these vessels come from? Sarah's voice cut through the chaos with deadly calm. You want to know about human technology, Ambassador? You're right that what you saw in the Kepler sector represented our current capabilities. But you made one critical error in your assessment of my species. The transmission switched to show one of the massive vessels in detail. Its hull was marked with symbols that made several representatives recoil in recognition and fear. Ancient symbols. Symbols that predated the current galactic civilization by millions of years. You assumed that everything we knew about space, we learned from you, Sarah continued. That Earth was our first and only world. That humanity was limited to one small solar system and a handful of primitive colonies. The reality of what they were seeing began to dawn on the more knowledgeable council members. The Threnodai representatives' breathing apparatus began cycling rapidly as panic set in. The ancients, he whispered. Those are ancient designs. But the ancients vanished millions of years ago. They're extinct. They have to be extinct. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the chamber, and it was not a pleasant expression. Extinct is such a relative term, don't you think? The civilization you call the ancients never vanished. They simply went elsewhere. Far elsewhere. Beyond this galaxy entirely. She gestured toward the display where more ships continued to emerge from hyperspace. You see, Earth isn't humanity's birthworld. It's where we ended up after our real home became uninhabitable. We've spent the last 50,000 years in exile, rebuilding, growing stronger, developing technologies that would make your most advanced species look primitive. The chamber had fallen into absolute silence except for the emergency alarms still echoing from the monitoring station. The humans you've met, the ones you've dismissed as backward and weak, they're refugees. descendants of a scientific expedition that was stranded in this galaxy when the hyperspace gates collapsed. They've been sending signals home for decades, telling us about their new life, their struggles, their attempts to integrate with galactic society. The display switched to show targeting solutions appearing around every hegemony military installation, every shipyard, every planetary defense grid. The ancient vessels had achieved perfect orbital positioning around every major hegemony world in the span of minutes. We've been watching, learning, waiting. And, when you decided to massacre our lost children, you made the single greatest mistake in your species' history. Ambassador Sekathar's voice came out as a terrified whisper. But, the Council recognized our right to discipline the humans. We acted within galactic law. Sarah's expression hardened to something that resembled carved ice. Your law. Not ours. You want to know why our people didn't fight back when you attacked them? Because they knew we were coming. Because they knew that every civilian you murdered, every child you killed, every hospital you destroyed was being recorded and transmitted across the galactic void to our real fleet. The display showed energy readings building in the massive vessel's weapon systems. Power signatures that exceeded anything in galactic records. They didn't fight back because they knew that resistance would only give you an excuse to claim self-defense. They let you reveal your true nature to the entire galaxy. They died so that when we arrived, no one could question our right to justice. High Arbiter Quelnath found her voice, though it trembled with an emotion most of her species had forgotten they could feel. What do you want? Sarah's answer came without hesitation. Unconditional surrender of the hegemony of Voss. Reparations to every surviving human from the Kepler sector. And a complete restructuring of galactic law to include protections for civilian populations that cannot be overridden by political convenience. And, if we refuse? Sekathar managed to ask. Sarah's smile returned, cold and final. Then, you'll discover what happened to the last galaxy that thought humanity was weak. The emergency session had devolved into chaos. Representatives from dozens of species shouted demands and accusations in languages that overwhelmed the translation systems. Some delegates had activated their personal defense shields, while others huddled in groups according to ancient alliance patterns that hadn't mattered for centuries. The Krugan representative had drawn what appeared to be a ceremonial weapon, though against what threat was unclear. Above it all, the massive displays continued showing the impossible sight of ancient vessels maintaining perfect formation around hegemony worlds. The power readings alone defied every known law of physics. Each ship generated enough energy to power entire star systems, yet somehow contained it all within hulls that seemed to bend space around them. High Arbiter Quelnath finally managed to restore some semblance of order by activating the chamber's emergency silence field. The artificial quiet that descended felt more oppressive than the previous chaos. Ambassador Chen, she began, her forearms trembling slightly, these demands you present are unprecedented. The Galactic Council has existed for over 50,000 years. We have procedures, protocols, established methods for resolving disputes between species. Sarah remained standing at the central platform, appearing remarkably calm amid the galaxy-shaking revelation she had just delivered. Your procedures failed my people, High Arbiter. 4.7 million beings died while your council debated whether their murders constituted acceptable losses. The Xantharian delegate, whose species held considerable influence in council matters, activated his speaking permissions. Even accepting the truth of what we're witnessing, surely reasonable beings can negotiate a settlement that doesn't require threats of galactic warfare. The hegemony's actions, while regrettable, hardly justify this display of overwhelming force. Reasonable beings, Sarah repeated, her voice carrying a note that made several translators emit warning tones. Were the hegemony forces being reasonable when they used orbital bombardment on elementary schools? When they deployed bioweapons specifically designed to cause maximum suffering before death? When they hunted down medical evacuation ships? She gestured toward the display, which now showed detailed tactical readouts from the ancient fleet. You want to talk about overwhelming force? Let me show you what overwhelming force actually looks like. The display zoomed in on one of the massive vessels orbiting the hegemony capital world. As the council watched, sections of the ship's hull began to reconfigure themselves. What they had initially taken for solid metal revealed itself to be composed of billions of microscopic components, each one individually capable of independent action. This single vessel contains approximately 14 billion autonomous combat units, Sarah explained with clinical precision. Each unit is roughly equivalent to your most advanced fighter craft in terms of firepower and maneuverability. The ship itself is primarily a manufacturing facility, capable of producing another 14 billion units every 6 hours using harvested stellar material. The mathematics were staggering. Ambassador Esikathar's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely as his species' survival instincts overrode his capacity for speech. But manufacturing capacity is just the beginning, Sarah continued. Each vessel also carries what we call reality adjustment technology. Weapons that operate by temporarily suspending the laws of physics in localized areas. Would you like a demonstration? Before anyone could respond, she spoke into her communicator again. Admiral Morrison, please provide a minimal demonstration of reality adjustment technology. Target the abandoned mining facility in the Kepler debris field. The display shifted to show a massive asteroid that had been hollowed out for mineral extraction decades earlier. It was roughly the size of Earth's moon, composed primarily of dense metallic compounds that should have been effectively indestructible by conventional means. One of the ancient vessels, positioned several light minutes away from the asteroid, extended what appeared to be a simple crystalline array. There was no visible energy discharge, no dramatic light show. The asteroid simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not vaporized, not reduced to component atoms. It was simply no longer there, as if reality had been edited to remove it from existence. The silence that followed was profound. Several council members had stopped breathing entirely, their species' biology shutting down non-essential functions in response to existential terror. The demonstration target contained approximately 40 trillion tons of matter, Sarah noted conversationally. The energy required to accomplish what you just witnessed using conventional physics would require harvesting the total output of a main sequence star for approximately 3,000 years. Our reality adjustment technology accomplished the same result using roughly the same amount of power needed to operate a standard personal communicator. The VOS delegation had retreated to the farthest corner of their allocated space. Ambassador Esikathar's translator finally managed to process his attempts at speech. This is madness. No species should possess such power. The very existence of such technology threatens the stability of the entire galaxy. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. You're absolutely correct. Which is precisely why my ancestors chose to leave this galaxy rather than remain here as gods among insects. They understood that the existence of such power differentials inevitably leads to tyranny, oppression, and the stagnation of younger species. She turned to address the full assembly. For 50,000 years, we stayed away. We found other galaxies, other challenges, other forms of life that could interact with us as equals rather than subjects. We built societies based on cooperation rather than domination. We became something better than what we had been. Then, why return now? High Arbiter Quelnath asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Because you took our children and murdered them for sport, Sarah replied, and, for the first time since the session began, genuine emotion colored her words. The humans you've been interacting with for the past 47 cycles, they're our descendants. Genetic drift and adaptation to local conditions changed their appearance somewhat, but they carry our DNA, our cultural memories, our fundamental humanity. The display shifted to show detailed genealogical data that traced the connection between the exiled human populations and the returning ancient fleets. The scientific accuracy was undeniable. When the hyperspace gates collapsed 50,000 years ago, several expeditionary groups were stranded in this galaxy. Over the millennia, they lost most of their advanced technology, but they retained enough scientific knowledge to eventually achieve basic interstellar travel. They began sending radio signals into deep space, hoping that someday we might detect them and establish contact. Sarah's voice grew softer, more personal. 14,000 years ago, we received the first signals. We've been monitoring their progress ever since, watching them slowly rebuild civilization, celebrating their achievements, mourning their losses. They became our window into what we had left behind. The implications were staggering. Every human achievement, every human tragedy, every interaction between humanity and the Galactic Council had been observed by beings with the power to unmake reality itself. You want to know why we stayed hidden for so long? Sarah continued. Because we learned from our mistakes. In our original galaxy, our presence prevented other species from developing to their full potential. Our very existence made them dependent, weak, unable to face challenges on their own terms. We promised ourselves we would never make that mistake again. But, watching your children be murdered changed that perspective, the Threnody representative observed, his breathing apparatus cycling rapidly. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. We could tolerate territorial disputes, trade conflicts, even minor military actions. But, systematic genocide? The deliberate targeting of civilian populations? The casual dismissal of mass murder by this council? That crossed every line we had drawn. She gestured toward the displays showing the ancient fleet. These ships represent the full military might of 3 spiral galaxies. Every vessel is crewed by beings who have personally lost descendants to the hegemony's actions. They're not here as conquerors or rulers. They're here as grieving relatives seeking justice for murdered family members. The weight of that revelation settled over the chamber like a physical force. The assembled representatives began to understand that they weren't facing a military invasion or political coup. They were witnessing the return of angry gods whose children had been killed. Ambassador Esikadar made one final attempt at diplomacy, though his voice carried none of its earlier arrogance. Surely there must be some way to resolve this situation without destroying entire civilizations. The hegemony could pay reparations, submit to council oversight, even accept complete disarmament. Sarah shook her head slowly. The hegemony will be dissolved. That's not negotiable. The question is whether the rest of the galaxy will learn from this demonstration or whether additional lessons will be required. She turned to face High Arbiter Quelnath directly. We're offering you a choice that we never had. You can evolve beyond the system that allowed genocide to be dismissed as acceptable collateral damage, or you can join the hegemony in extinction. But, you cannot continue as you have been. The High Arbiter's response would determine the fate of trillions of beings across hundreds of worlds. The ancient fleet waited in perfect silence, reality adjustment weapons powered and ready for the Galactic Council's decision. The future of civilized space hung in the balance, dependent on whether ancient wisdom could overcome political inertia in the face of overwhelming power. Outside the crystalline chamber, emergency broadcasts were already spreading the news across the galaxy that everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The deliberation recess had lasted 18 hours, an unprecedented length for the Galactic Council. During that time, emergency sessions had convened among every major species alliance. Diplomatic channels burned with frantic communications as entire civilizations attempted to process the fundamental shift in galactic power dynamics. Some species had immediately begun transmitting formal apologies to the human delegation, while others had retreated to their home systems and activated every defensive system at their disposal. The ancient fleet remained motionless around hegemony worlds, neither advancing nor retreating. Their very presence had paralyzed interstellar commerce as trade ships refused to travel anywhere near the impossible vessels. Stock markets across the galaxy had collapsed. 3 minor species had preemptively surrendered to Earth, despite receiving no threats. When the Council reconvened, the atmosphere in the crystalline chamber had changed completely. Gone were the dismissive attitudes and casual arrogance that had characterized interspecies politics for millennia. Representatives who had previously treated diplomatic sessions as social events now moved with the careful precision of beings who understood they were making decisions that could result in the extinction of their entire species. High Arbiter Quelnath rose from her position, her forearms moving through the formal gestures required for rendering final judgment in matters of galactic importance. Her voice, when it came through the translators, carried the weight of 50,000 years of accumulated wisdom and the fear of beings who had suddenly discovered they were not the apex predators they had believed themselves to be. The Galactic Council has reached a decision regarding the demands presented by the Terran delegation and the current crisis with the hegemony of Voss. She paused, her ancient eyes finding Sarah's face among the assembled delegates. Before rendering our judgment, we wish to state for the record that the emergence of ancient technology has fundamentally altered our understanding of galactic civilization. We acknowledge that our previous policies and procedures were developed without awareness of the true scope of existing power structures. Sarah remained silent, waiting. Around her, the human delegation maintained the same careful composure they had displayed throughout the crisis. Behind their calm facades, however, the weight of billions of lives hung in the balance. The Council hereby renders the following judgments, the High Arbiter continued. First, regarding the hegemony of Voss and their actions in the Kepler sector. After reviewing the evidence presented and consulting with our most respected xenobiologists and military strategists, we find that the systematic targeting of civilian populations constituted genocide under galactic law. The fact that this genocide was previously dismissed as acceptable collateral damage represents a failure of Council oversight that cannot be allowed to continue. Ambassador Sekathar's mandibles began clicking rapidly in what human translators identified as the Voss equivalent of hyperventilation. Around him, his delegation had already begun activating personal emergency beacons, though what help they expected to receive was unclear. Therefore, the High Arbiter pronounced, the Galactic Council formally dissolves the hegemony of Voss as a recognized political entity. All hegemony military assets are to be immediately surrendered to Joint Council oversight. All hegemony territories will be placed under direct Council administration until such time as legitimate governments can be established that respect civilian populations. The Voss delegation erupted in protests, but their voices were drowned out as the High Arbiter continued. Furthermore, the Council accepts full responsibility for our failure to prevent the Kepler genocide. Reparations in the amount of 5 trillion galactic standard credits will be paid to the surviving human populations from Kepler sector colonies. These funds will be drawn from Council emergency reserves and mandatory contributions from all member species. Murmurs of concern rippled through the chamber as representatives calculated the financial impact on their own civilizations. 5 trillion credits represented the total economic output of dozens of star systems for an entire year. However, the High Arbiter's voice rose to override the growing discussion. These measures address only the immediate crisis. The emergence of ancient technology and the return of humanity's true civilization requires fundamental changes to galactic governance itself. Sarah stepped forward slightly, her expression indicating interest in hearing the Council's proposed solutions. The Council hereby establishes the Universal Civilian Protection Protocols, the High Arbiter announced. Under these protocols, the deliberate targeting of non-combatant populations will be classified as a crime against galactic civilization, punishable by immediate intervention from the Council's combined military forces. No political justification, territorial dispute, or ancient grievance will be accepted as grounds for civilian casualties. The scope of the proposed changes was staggering. Conflicts that had simmered for centuries would suddenly be subject to unprecedented oversight. Species that had built their military doctrines around terrorizing enemy populations would be forced to completely restructure their approach to warfare. Additionally, the High Arbiter continued, the Council will establish a permanent monitoring system to detect and investigate potential violations of civilian protection protocols. This system will include independent observers, real-time surveillance of conflict zones, and rapid response capabilities to prevent massacres before they occur. A Krugan representative activated his speaking permissions. High Arbiter, while these protocols serve admirable goals, their implementation would require resources and authority that far exceed the Council's current capabilities. Many member species would resist such extensive oversight of their internal affairs. The High Arbiter's response was immediate and decisive. Then, those species are welcome to withdraw from the Council and forfeit all benefits of galactic civilization. The choice is membership under the new protocols or isolation from interstellar commerce, technology sharing, and mutual defense agreements. The ultimatum was unprecedented. For the first time in galactic history, the Council was demanding that member species choose between sovereignty and participation in the broader galactic community. The financial and technological costs of isolation would be catastrophic for most civilizations. Sarah spoke for the first time since the session had reconvened. The Council's proposed reforms are acceptable to the Terran Federation and our allied governments. However, we have one additional requirement. She gestured toward the displays showing the ancient fleet. These vessels will remain in this galaxy permanently. They will serve as the enforcement mechanism for the civilian protection protocols. Any species that violates these protocols will face the same response that the hegemony received. The implications were clear. The ancient fleet wasn't just a temporary show of force. It represented a permanent shift in the balance of galactic power, with humanity serving as the ultimate arbiters of acceptable behavior. Furthermore, Sarah continued, the Council will establish formal diplomatic relations with the Terran deep space territories. While we have no desire to interfere in day-to-day galactic politics, we will maintain a permanent embassy to ensure that the lessons of the Kepler genocide are never forgotten. High Arbiter Quelnath nodded slowly. The Council accepts these terms. However, we must ask what assurance we have that humanity will not use its overwhelming technological advantage to establish a galactic tyranny? Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. You have the same assurance we gave our own descendants 50,000 years ago. We could have remained in this galaxy and ruled as gods. Instead, we chose to leave and allow younger species to develop without our interference. The only thing that brought us back was the mass murder of our children. She gestured toward the council chambers. We have no interest in ruling you. We want to live in a galaxy where our descendants can build peaceful relationships with other species without fearing genocide. If you can provide that assurance, we have no reason to interfere with your civilizations. The vote was unanimous, though several species abstained rather than risk being perceived as opposing the new order. The hegemony of Voss was formally dissolved. The Universal Civilian Protection Protocols were established with immediate effect. The ancient fleet took up permanent patrol positions throughout the galaxy. In the months that followed, the changes were dramatic. 3 ongoing conflicts ended immediately when combatants realized that targeting civilians would result in intervention by forces capable of erasing entire star systems. Trade agreements began including specific provisions for protecting non-combatant populations. Military academies across the galaxy completely rewrote their tactical doctrines. The hegemony worlds underwent rapid transformation under Council administration. Voss military commanders faced trials for war crimes. Reparations flowed to human survivors of the Kepler genocide. New governments formed based on principles of civilian protection and species equality. Ambassador Sarachan established the Terran embassy in the orbital city housing the Galactic Council. The building itself was unremarkable by galactic standards, but its significance was profound. For the first time in 50,000 years, the ancients had chosen to maintain a permanent presence among younger species. The galaxy had learned a terrible but necessary lesson. Power without responsibility inevitably leads to tragedy. But power combined with the wisdom born from loss and exile could create something better. The age of casual genocide had ended, replaced by an era where the deliberate murder of civilians would face consequences beyond imagination. The ancient fleet continued its silent patrol, a constant reminder that some lines should never be crossed. And, in the depths of space, humanity began the long process of deciding whether exile had truly ended, or whether they were simply visiting old friends before returning to the stars they had made their true home. The galaxy would never be the same. But, perhaps, for the first time in its history, it might actually be safe for those too weak to defend themselves. The Kepler genocide had been the last of its kind, ended by the return of beings who remembered what it meant to lose everything and had gained the power to ensure it never happened again.